InvestorIdeas.com podcast. Hello, and welcome to another episode of InvestorIdeas.com podcast. In today's podcast, I interview Jigar Patel, who is the CEO of NorCal Cannabis, one of the largest cannabis operators in California and number one seller of indoor flower, powering beloved brands such as Lolo, One Life, and Panacea, where we discuss surviving in the California cannabis industry, brand creation, inflation on cannabis sales, as well as the California cannabis cafes and how those are evolving.
Okay, so today I'm here talking with Jigar Patel, who is the CEO of NorCal Cannabis. Jigar, it's great to be able to talk to you. For our listeners who are unfamiliar with yourself and as NorCal, can you maybe just give a brief background of how you ended up in the cannabis industry and how that led you to NorCal?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. I guess my cannabis journey really began with consumption of the product at a young age. Like a lot of folks in my teens, I started trying cannabis, and for me, it was really an eye-opening thing. Son of immigrants, kind of had this path where I was supposed to, go be a doctor or a pharmacist and get a house and get married, and that was kind of what the immigrant story was, of the American dream. And I think cannabis opened me up to a whole world which I didn't really see prior to that, and introduced me to lots of folks from different backgrounds. And when I went to school at Purdue, I ended up meeting some folks that were growing cannabis back then. Obviously, in those days, it was highly illegal. And some of those same guys actually had moved to California in the late 90s because of Prop 215 here. And so, I stayed in contact with them, learned about what was going on in the space, and quickly knew that I wanted to be in it. So kind of really dove into the culture of cannabis here in Northern California. Really seeing what it was about and what was the whole Prop 215 thing, right? Like, not many people in those days really understood what it meant. And it was the quasi-legal way of providing medical cannabis to patients under the old system here in California. So quickly realized this is where I wanted to be, and moved out here in the early 2000s, and then jumped in really into the political realm and started to understand how I could help effectuate change at the local level. And so worked with Sonoma County, worked with the city of San Francisco on a lot of their cannabis policies early on. So I jumped in with 2 feet and built a grow in San Francisco, and that was really the beginning of NorCal. And during that time, I'd come across my other 2 co-founders, Blair Carter and Doug Cortina, who were doing a very similar thing in the same neighborhood in San Francisco. And we quickly realized we were stronger together. And so, that initial partnership is the beginning of NorCal. And today we operate about 100,000 square feet of production, almost 30,000 square feet of canopy at our Santa Rosa campus.
That's such a fantastic story to hear, that I find is so refreshing, because there's so much of this industry right now that's people coming from CPG backgrounds and finance backgrounds, and a lot of people who, business acumen, who just saw the opportunity. It's great to hear that you actually were involved with the culture, actually involved with the product initially, because I do think that that's what creates. There's not a lot of easy ways to fake it, basically, in the cannabis industry. And, at the end of the day, if you're going to sell good product, you need to know what good product is yourself. You can't just be a person who sort of sits on the outside. So I guess, can you maybe give me a brief overlay of where NorCal is now as far as brands, distribution in California, and sort of where you guys are looking at yourselves today?
Obviously, for us, lead cultivators that I've been working with for almost 20 some years, and we've stayed together as a team, which is very rare in this space. So we operate 3 brands, One Life, Panacea, and Lolo. Really, that's the good, better, best of indoor flower. And along with that, we also make other products. But, our core capabilities really is indoor cultivation. We really believe we are some of the most efficient operators in the space. And because we are efficient, it allows us to actually provide, especially in our brand Lolo, allows us to actually lead with quality, consistency, but also price. And in today's market, as competition comes online and more of it comes online everywhere, we believe that you have to be able to compete on price to really gain that traction with the consumer. And because we are so efficient at what we do, we're able to provide that value to the consumer consistently. And we believe we're able to do that. We have the makings of a real brand. I don't think we've truly seen a real brand in cannabis yet. And I think we've latched onto something really good with Lolo. I think it resonates with the consumer. I think the value proposition is perfect, and especially given the macro climate today. It's not easy out there for anybody, and so we think that we've kind of hit a home run with Lolo.
So I'd like to get right into that. When you're looking at creating a brand, that is what I think a lot of companies are aiming for. As you said, I don't think really anyone has succeeded so far in any sort of dramatic way. What are sort of the big obstacles that you see the industry is facing maybe as a whole when it comes to creating a brand? Obviously, there's lots to do with marketing. That's kind of a given. But there seems to be a lot of other sort of barriers. And how have you sort of started to see real success with Lolo? Where have you seen the biggest traction, not just in sort of price point and quality, but what else really attracts a consumer, and how do you make them try your product, I guess, initially, right?
Yeah, I think, when we started NorCal, and in the early days, like everybody else, we raised a bunch of money and we had brought on a strong marketing team. And I think that even when you talk to those folks that were part of that marketing team early on, I think what they will tell you is, everybody had grand ideas for how to really market cannabis, but nobody had ever really done it, right? They didn't understand how the system worked. They didn't understand the supply chain. And, as we brought in these great marketers who had come from very diverse backgrounds, but were all professionals in what they did, I think what they realized quickly was like, this wasn't digital marketing. This wasn't Twitter. This wasn't any of the stuff that they were used to. This was a knife fight. Those were their words. They're like, this is a straight up knife fight. And I think it became clear that these monster marketing budgets weren't really doing much. They weren't moving the needle, right? You would get media play out of it. They'd get a lot of attraction, but the ROI of actually selling cannabis wasn't there. And, I think what we did, which was a little different, is when we did do our marketing push early on, is we spent a lot of time on business intelligence early. And what we were able to do there was utilize some of our historical knowledge of what happens in the space, combined with data that was showing, or that was coming up now that we finally had access to. And we're able to look and say, what does the consumer really want? What is the power consumer? What do they want, right? And if you look at the power consumer in California, it always came back that they cared about quality, consistency, and price. And a bell went off for us. It's like, look, we don't have to do much. We don't have to spend a bunch of money on marketing. If we can hit those three things and provide that to the consumer, it will resonate. And so, if you look at Lolo over the last year, we sold almost 1 million eighths of flower, which is pretty crazy to think about in a state like California, where competition is crazy. And the fact that it's indoor flower is even more, I think says more. And when we look at other states and realize that most states don't have the ability to grow outdoors, you start to see how Lolo can actually be a brand that actually resonates nationwide, right? As long as the feds don't legalize, which they're not going to do anytime soon, in our opinion, you'll be able to have, I kind of almost think of it like Coca-Cola bottling plants, but we'll be able to actually have different indoor facilities in different states producing the same type of product, and bringing that to the consumer. Honestly, like, one of the things that we really pride ourselves on is how fresh our product is. So when you think about one of the things that we've done differently here is because we know the consumer and we do know the space, we saw early on that product that was sitting on shelves just didn't move. And, look, it would oxidize and then you'd have to discount it. And what a horrible thing, right? You spend all this time creating this wonderful plant and getting it ready to take to market. You get it to market and it just sits, right? So there's, I think one of the obstacles, and I think this one of the things you alluded to earlier is, the entire market is still so nascent that it's really hard to be efficient at one part of the supply chain if you don't have the other parts of it actually just as efficient and mature. So in today's market, we look for strong partnerships and mature operators to work with, especially on the retail side. The better the retailer, the better it is for us, because we know there's a lot of sell through, and we also know that they're not overstocking their shelves, and they know how to actually buy better than a lot of these other retailers.
So that's great. I wanted to ask about that anyways, which is, what are sort of some of the difficulties when you're looking at the California retail market? Because there's been a lot of reporting lately on the amount of illicit operations that are competing with the recreational space. And that's a big issue. As far as an actual retail partner that is successful, what are some of the sort of factors that you've noticed have actually worked? Is it just in-house staff training, or is it, sort of shelf diversity, as in like what actual products are they carrying because there's so many producers there? What's some of the biggest considerations you look for?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at the strong retail partners, obviously the chains have the buying power because they have multiple stores, right? So what you're doing is they're actually using the data that they're seeing now from their POS systems, right? And what they're able to do is actually use that data and provide feedback to us. So, what we look for in strong retail partners are ones that are sitting there willing to work with us and giving us the information so we can help better serve them, right? I think the other part of it is that field marketing, bud tender training. The stores that really push that and that are doing demo days and that are out there talking to the consumer and letting the brands talk to the consumer, we see a lot more traction in it. And I think you're going to continue to see that because as the space evolves, we feel like that's probably your best use of marketing dollars, is actually getting in front of the consumer, letting them try the product, giving them an understanding of where the product comes from, and what the product's about. And I think, gone are the days of just putting a label on something and sticking it on the shelf and weed selling and stuff. Those days have been gone for a couple decades now. So, I think just as the entire industry matures, we have to mature with it, right? And I think this is just the beginning. And people keep talking about this is the first inning, this is the second inning. If you look at the lifetime of this, I don't even think the game has begun yet.
So when you are looking at quality, this is the biggest discussion we have in this industry. Is everybody is obviously all about quality. Everyone says they're producing premium quality. What are, you've mentioned consistency and freshness. I think that is actually a huge factor that people need. If they're going to be coming back to your product, if you want to actually create a brand, it needs to be consistent. We've seen that in every industry, whether you're looking at cannabis or, Pepsi or anything. You want to be buying the same thing. You don't want to be surprised by what you're coming back to the store for. When you're looking at actual sort of quality factors, what are the biggest considerations you've sort of analyzed from looking at data and dealing with consumers? Is it, bud density? Is it the terpene profile? Is THC content still sort of the big deciding factor? Is it specific strains? What things really actually seem to hit people? Is it the actual effect? You're looking for a specific desired result as far as every time it gets you this amount of high or gives you this sensation?
Yeah, no, I great question. And I think, unfortunately in today's cannabis world, THC percentage is what drives the consumer initially. But I think once you start to see brand loyalty, and what we see is, we started Lolo, we had about, I want to say 8 different SKUs out there. And what we realized is actually having a diverse book of strains, not just high THC, but different terpene profiles, sativas, indicas, and giving the consumer those options was actually great. And what we saw was we were able to actually move our consumers from those that are just looking at high THC into those specifically asking for certain profiles of terpenes or certain types of strains or certain types of genetics. And we think we've been able to make that dent. But, I go back to, it's still so early, you have to do your part. And it's not going to happen overnight, right? To get people off of this high THC thing, it's going to take work and effort. And, it's unfortunate because a lot of great strains get lost in this whole shuffle. I've seen plenty of strains that we would smoke and love to smoke and would love to sell. And from a yield factor, do really, really well for us. But, if they're not hitting that, let's call it 27% THC, you're really getting blocked at a lot of retailers. I think that there's a lot of work to do there in terms of that, but we're getting there, and it'll take time. And I think if you make the equation to alcohol, right, or wine, for example, I know people don't like making these, but people don't go shopping for wine based on the percentage of alcohol in the wine, right? There's definitely a very specific profile you're looking for, or region, and I think that as we evolve, obviously you'll start to see more of that.
How far off do you think that needs to be as far as consumer education and sort of consumer awareness of this product? Is this 5 to 10 years out, or is this like a 10 to 20, getting into a few decades where we're going to almost need a new generation of cannabis buyer who grows up exposed to this, as opposed to, I think California, lots of parts of the world, we have a mixed bag of people who are in this industry, who are looking to buy cannabis products. You have old people, you have young people, you have people doing it for medical reasons, people doing it just for, recreational use. But I've found this conversation comes up kind of over and over again, which is most people still don't know really shit about what's going on, where everyone's still kind of just grasping at straws when they come into a dispensary. They're like, I want that one because I bought it before, or they just ask the bud tender. And even the bud tenders are mainly going off of what companies like yourself and reps in the industry kind of promote to them, and they kind of go by that information. And obviously they have their own preferences, but they're still not comparing it to wine. Wine culture is hundreds if not thousands of years old. In certain countries it's their entire culture. Is that what we need, like a couple of decades worth of cannabis for it to get to a point
I mean, I think what it's going to be is like, look, we've had a couple of decades, right? So there's connoisseurs, right? Commercializing this product for the masses is the real question, right? And how long will that take? I think that's the great unknown. I don't think anybody expected it to move as fast as it did. It's been pretty crazy to watch over the last 5 years. I mean, I think a lot of that push obviously came from the Illinois groups that had access to capital and, really were off to the races. So it's happening at a much quicker pace than anybody really imagined. But, how quickly is that adaptation? I'd probably say 10 years plus, and I think it's going to take that type of time, right? You're seeing it today. Like you get a lot of these, just if you just look at the industry as a whole, right? Like people got money and they just started building grows and building shops. Like it was just a race. And I think what you're seeing now is people are trying to figure out how to right size their ships quite a bit.
Absolutely.
And you don't need millions and millions of square feet, right? Like of canopy to do this right. And I think, I think over the next 5 to 10 years, which we'll start to see is kind of the differentiation between the medical benefits of cannabis and how people use cannabis medically, and then the recreational benefits. And through that process, we'll see different types of commercialization of the plant. A perfect example of this is I can't tell you enough of every time I meet somebody, call it my age or older, that has never smoked or participated in cannabis at all. The minute, they know that you own a dispensary, the first thing they say is, hey, do you have anything to help me sleep? Like, I can't tell you how many times I get asked that question a week, from random people who you wouldn't think would be part of the industry. So and so what that signals to me is like people are starting to see the medical benefits of it and actually thinking about the medical benefits. I'll give you a perfect example is I know some law enforcement officers who were like, man, I really need gummies to go to bed. It's like the one thing that they can use. There's two things that are funny about that. The first fact that I said, I know some law enforcement officers, which 10 years ago, I wouldn't get near one, right?
Yeah.
But secondly, the fact that even the police look at this as a medical benefit is really crazy to see. So I think you'll see one faction head towards the medical benefits. And obviously, you're seeing strides in research and you're seeing the pharmaceutical companies get into it. I think they will take a very pharmaceutical approach to that. But then I think as you look the other way to the rec side of things, we'll start to see things commercialized, much like we said earlier, like wine, where you'll have your $2 chuck, but you're also going to have, your really, really expensive cannabis that people will pay for, because there is still a market out there.
Another thing I wanted to ask about is obviously there's been a little bit of the hype around the cannabis cafes coming into California. How do you see that impacting specifically your brands and just the industry as a whole? Is that something that's going to be a big game changer, or is that going to take, quite a long time for people to actually even realize the benefits of, going to those places, and there'll still be the same lag time with everything else?
Yeah, look, I think anything that more normalizes or destigmatizes cannabis is great for the industry. I think the cafes are great. I think the one issue, that we've seen is just the inability to have food and or drinks with it. It takes away really the recreational aspect of it. I'm a firm believer in letting people do what they want to do. And I think the more we can normalize that and allow that, the better it is for the plant. So, we're proponents of the cafe. We think that it's a huge step forward. We would love to see, cannabis being treated like any other business. And so, again, the ability to have food and drinks and cannabis at the same time, like, we're adults here. I think that's okay.
Yeah, I think that is kind of the biggest missing ingredient that I see for the industry is we still don't really have normalized spaces to consume cannabis. We have lots of places to buy cannabis, lots of different methods of consumption, but there isn't the bar equivalent or the cafe or the anything equivalent that you see for alcohol, or just general restaurants. And I find that's, if you're always going home to smoke your weed, it always kind of remains this kind of closed door operation, which I find gives into the stigma. It does need to be out in the daylight. It does need to be something that people see and walk by and smell a cafe and go, that looks good, as opposed to, that's sketchy.
You're right. I mean, it is. It's making it's like you provide all these things, and then you're like, oh, there's nowhere for you to consume, right? And again, look, some people love cannabis kind of as a personal thing, but a lot of people, at least for me and our group of friends, is this very social thing, right? And so again, having that ability to be places. I mean, look, in California for the last 20 years, you can go to any music venue and smoke. Nobody's really going to say anything. That's just part of the culture here. But people want to be able to partake when they're at a venue or at a concert, right? And again, the more we allow that, I think the better, and I think it'll help progress the entire movement.
So I want to ask as well about, obviously there's been a lot of things impacting sales in California, but pretty much everywhere, everyone's been impacted by inflation. No industries have gotten a free pass with that. Have you seen, for your brand specifically, obviously, because you kind of have that, good, better, best scenario, have you seen buying preferences changed? Have you seen sort of consumer habits change that dramatically as far as even the amounts that they're buying? You mentioned selling, 1 million eighths. Are people going to smaller purchase products, or are they going to vapes? Are they going to pre-rolls? Is any of that really changing that much, or is it just kind of slightly less sales overall?
Yeah, I think what we see, it's a little bit of everything that you just said. I think, well, let's first address inflation, right? I think the inflation, the pressures of inflation are dramatic to the space, but the issue you have in cannabis is because so much product is coming online, while all of our suppliers are raising our prices, we're actually going the other way in terms of what we're selling product. Right. So imagine this, you're paying 20% more for all of your supplies, but you're getting paid 20% less. It becomes very drastic in terms of how you operate your business. So, we have to become leaner and meaner and more efficient, which is what we strive for every day. So, there is definitely we are feeling that crunch. I think we are not immune from it. I think probably feeling it more than most. Sorry, what was the second part of that question you asked me?
Just what are you seeing as far as if consumer buying preferences have changed? Yeah.
Yeah. So look, right now the value brands are really what is driving the space. You're seeing a lot of growth there. Pre-rolls are still really hot. I think we see this vacillation between vapes and flower, and I always look at it and I look at the data, and you see these percentage changes. I haven't seen anything too drastic. I think, it look, the flower consumer generally remains the flower consumer. People that have been smoking flower for years, it's pretty hard to get them to transition over into just vapes. We see vape consumers who will try flower after being introduced to vapes, right? So, but I think, all the categories, when you look at them year over year, are growing. But what you're seeing right now, I think they just came out and said the California sales tax for Q2 was down drastic, or Q4 was down drastically. I think what you're seeing is really just the lowering of prices and that effect of it. So competition is playing a big role in everything today.
So that's another big thing that's being discussed, not just in California, but everywhere, is this kind of endless price drop. How do you see that, leveling out? Are we near the bottom as far as the price of cannabis, or is it going to get, sort of preposterously low at a certain point where you'll have to basically be either one of two categories, either a gigantic company that's, getting their profit off of cents on the dollar, or you have to be this sort of micro cultivator that's really boutique and aiming for a very specific, sort of consumer demographic?
I think that commoditization will come, but again, not as quickly as you think. I think, again, in order for like the massive growth to have a real impact nationally, like we need the federal barriers to be gone, right? And so, again, I think while that still remains, you'll still see medium-sized players that are efficient, that can operate. And again, it just goes back to really how efficient you are. And it's not always about how big you are, but because we see a lot of big operators who just can't keep their costs down.
Yeah.
And in turn, when they try and keep their costs down, they're putting out shitty product. I think that there's a happy medium there. And in terms of like, have we seen the bottom? Hard to tell. I think we're gonna have like a little roller coaster ride of ups and downs, because you still have people that are trying to still maintain relevancy in the industry. But a perfect example is California. Last year, it looked like a lot of people didn't plant, and now that there's been a little bit of an uptick in prices, what you're seeing is everybody's going back to planting again, right? And so you're going to have this kind of seesaw effect for a little while till people really understand where the pricing kind of bottoms out, but also like, what's the true cost, right? I mean, when you talk to operators, whether they be in Illinois or Florida or California, or Oregon or Colorado, the cost of, the cogs that go into, indoor operations are all over the board, right? I've heard as high as $1,700 a pound for some people to grow a pound, right? And again, like in California, if you can't sell that thing for $1,700 a pound, you're not getting $1,800 a pound here, right? So again, like what you'll end up seeing is just basic business principles will come into effect, and those that aren't able to operate at a high level or an efficient level will most likely be out of the space.
So you've referenced it a couple of times, but for a company like yourself, for NorCal, is it beneficial for federal legalization to come through, or federal decriminalization? And sort of, is that something that you see a lot of companies are rooting for, or is that kind of just the main play for like the huge MSOs who have invested so much that they eventually need access to, federal banking, federal funding, all those things? That obviously it makes sense to me why they want it, because they paid so much to build those huge operations. But for an individual operator like yourself, is that a benefit, or is it better if you can kind of do the state by state play, as you said, kind of having a Coca-Cola bottling plant for NorCal?
No, I think, look, federal legalization is great. It's a great win overall for everybody. So like that is the end goal, and we wish that. I think even for a company like ours, in that type of scenario, we would have regional, call it factories, that are producing product. Again, back to like the maturing of the entire industry, like the ability to get product from California to a shop in Maine, like there is a lot of logistics that go into that, right? So just think of like UNFI and moving natural foods right across the country. And again, I go back to freshness is a thing in the flower game. That if you don't have a very mature supply chain to get from A to B, like there's a problem. So I think the way we think about this long term is, if and when federal legalization happens, it will have almost regional facilities that'll be able to still service, within, call it, a day's drive of wherever it's produced.
That's a good way of thinking about it. So I guess just in final thoughts, when we are looking at sort of California in general, what's kind of the actual realistic expectations from the industry as far as maybe the next couple of years on what you could actually see change regulation wise to benefit the industry? Because again, this is a big discussion, as there's taxation issues, there's licensing fees, cost of operations. A lot of these things are not only hampering the companies that do exist, but they're also discouraging a lot of new companies from entering into the space, or, more sort of small owners and operators, because you need to have either entered at the right time, or you need to have a huge cash flow behind you to sort of get you into this space now. But I also know that there's a lot of dreams as far as what we'd like to see regulators do that don't really come through. I mean, I've heard about safe banking for, I think, 4 years now, and seen that get rejected every single time. I can't even pay attention to the news that comes out about it anymore, because I'm like, this is just a waste of my time. I'm not even going to read about it because I know nothing's going to happen. The Cannabis Cafe is allowing the food and beverages. That does seem like a big step forward. What's kind of something that you could see being realistic that could come through as far as a tax reduction or limited licensing fee, or something that the industry would benefit from that could actually happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be a reduction of the excise tax. What they did for cultivation tax in California was great. But again, it needs to be passed on to the consumer. And I think, a lot of these states, and I get it that they all wanted the tax revenue, but I think that the conversation needs to change from this just being about tax revenue to really about the jobs and employment, right? When we talk to people in a lot of these other states, and I'm glad to hear this, but I'm hearing people or politicians in other states that are like, forget the tax revenue. We have ways to tax and make money as a state. What we really want are the jobs, right? And I think that headset needs to change, and people need to start looking at us not as just a source of income for the state, but actually as like citizens and giving a shit about us, right? I think that will be a big change. As far as California goes over the next 2 years, look, there's no doubt that this is still the largest cannabis market in the world, and it is the most important. If you can't show that you win here, I don't know how you can actually say that you can win elsewhere, right? If you're in a limited license state, great. But what are you going to do inevitably when competition comes? And if you are not prepared for that because you've really just been reliant on limited license states, I think you're going to have an issue. And I think that's a question that's being posed to a lot of these big MSOs, right? Which is like, hey, how good of an operator are you really? Right? Like, it's great if you have these stores that are on the border of another state and you're doing, 100 million in sales, but like, what happens when that evaporates? What happens when there's 4 stores on that same block, right? What happens when there's 200 cultivators in your state? I think that these are all questions people need to be asking about what that looks like in the future. And I think inevitably it turns to, what I've been talking about now for the last couple of years is the rise of the operator. And I think that's what you're going to see out of California. The most mature operators will start to show themselves, and I think you'll start to see kind of how we had always envisioned was the West Coast operators headed east. Look, and that's nothing against people on the East or in the Midwest. Look, they're all professionals at what they've done. I think we just have the historical both knowledge but operating understanding of the market that I just don't think that these guys have ever seen.
I very much agree there. And I think going back to your sort of comparison to the wine industry, a big part of its culture. And California has actual cannabis culture. That's not a fake thing or something you guys just got into in the last few years. That's decades of cannabis culture that exists in that state, and very much like wine regions. You can grow wine in lots of places, but there's a sort of cultural aspect of prestige, and people in certain regions who grow up with that sort of in their blood just do it better. There's no way around it. The competition is fiercer, and people take it more seriously. And yeah, I do think that the limited license states have, short-term benefits right now, but I very much agree that in the long term, if you can't win in California, you're probably not going to win in other markets once, especially brands like yourself start being able to come out into other areas. That's going to be tough to deal with. As you said, if you win in the knife fight, you're going to do well in the other environments.
Yeah, look, I think it just prepares you, right? I think we are so conditioned for that knife fight every day that it's kind of in our blood, right? Like you said, when you walk through the NorCal campus, it's not like we just are hiring people out of other industries. I'd say the majority of people that work for us have been in the cannabis space for at least a decade.
Absolutely. And I do agree with you as well that I would hope that it eventually does change from taxation to jobs, because as you mentioned, there's already ways that, states can make money off the cannabis industry, just like they do every industry. Like they don't need to do an extra layer. If you're doing X amount of sales, there's a sales tax. Like it happens already. So why do you need an extra thing on top of that when you're already getting the money? Businesses still have to pay their regular taxation no matter what. And a profitable business paying regular taxes is still a lot of taxes. It doesn't need to
you have to incentivize,
but also
you have to incentivize the consumer, though, right? Like the consumer needs to be incentivized to go buy product at a legal store. And if you're charging them 20% more for essentially the same product that they can get from their buddy, well, what incentive is that for them? You can make the argument that this is tested and it's safe, and sure, we agree. But again, like at the end of the day, money talks, right? And I think, as much as we'd want to say, hey, come buy legal product, look, for the person making $15 an hour, spending $60 on an eighth or spending $35 on an eighth, like, a very easy sell for them to not spend that extra money.
Do you think that there will be anything that can actually slow down the black market in California, or do you think it'll always exist side by side to some extent until it eventually gets to a point, maybe 10 to 20 years down the road where people just stop giving a shit about cannabis in general and we treat it like, tomatoes basically, and you can have people selling cannabis at a farmer stand and be like, he's just a local guy, he sells it, that's his deal.
I think the hard thing for a lot of people to imagine, and I live it, right? I live in the middle of Northern California, so like I see it. You got to remember, we've been talking about culture, like it's been ingrained in people for so long, right? People have been growing weed for 30 and 40 years on their parents' properties. That you have this generation of folks, like this was our life. This is what we did, right? And to have that ripped away from you is pretty crazy, right? And so, when you think about the black market going away, what I do think is like, I don't think you're going to start seeing younger and younger growers getting into the game again. And I think that the old timers either will make the transition or at some point give up. I think just if I look regionally, and we pay a lot of attention to what happens in the black market because, look, it's all one market at the end of the day, so you need to understand what's happening. But when I talk to the grow shop owners or just locals around here, what I am seeing is a lot of those 10 lighters and 20 lighters and even 50 lighters that used to proliferate, the Sonoma, Napa, or Sonoma, Mendo landscape aren't there anymore. And people have no intent of putting them back up. I still think you will deal with a lot of the large, highly illegal operations that are, organized crime. I don't know how you'll stop that until they find something else that's more lucrative. At some point, people will stop giving a shit about it, especially as it commoditizes and becomes more mainstream to the point where, look, I mean, how many people are selling moonshine right now?
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. And I do think that that's a smart way to think, is it's a generational sort of gap that eventually will just happen organically. Because I do think if you're growing up with weed legal in front of you, it'd be weird for you to be like, I'm going to start my own illegal grow and everything, and not just think of it like a regular business and be like, no, I want to have a store and do these things and make my big brand and all of that. Like
there was no enterprise value in the black market, right? That's what I think the big thing that people don't really understand is, like, prior to the ability to raise money and actually have real enterprise values for these companies, this was a cash yield game, right? It was like whack-a-mole. People would put up as many plants for as many lights as they could, rake in as much cash as they could, and if they got caught, you shut it down, or something happened. You couldn't sell the business, right? And so, again, I think that as the conversation changes to enterprise value, it doesn't make sense. My kids aren't going to go to the grow shop and go put up a bunch of lights. They'd be like, why would I do that? I can go buy. So I think you'll see it over a generation change. And again, like, it is a little, again, just being from here and seeing it kind of get destroyed the way it is right now. It's a little sad to see. It's very sad to see, I'll be honest. I wish there was a way in which both, that legacy market could still exist in today's world, but it's just not how this went. And as much as we wanted it to go that way, those days are gone, and we have to live with what we have now.
Absolutely. Just one final thing there, because you kind of touched on it, which is, when you were telling me sort of your background of how you got into this, sort of the reverse of the traditional immigrant story. Do you think that that's another thing that might eventually change? Because in general, when we look at every part of the world, it's always immigrants who are doing the majority of the legwork, who are doing the majority of the agro work. Do you see that a next generation of sort of immigrants in America will look to cannabis, or is that kind of something that they'll still avoid because of stigma and different things attached from their countries?
I think that you're starting to see that stigma evaporate in terms of the ability to work in the space. I see people of every creed, color imaginable in cannabis today. I've seen a lot more acceptance from, I would say, the traditional Asian cultures that have always been kind of anti-drug. And so, it's great for me because I kind of feel like I was at the cutting edge of that early on, and to see more and more people of color or immigrants that would traditionally not be able to even talk about, cannabis with their parents, actually be in the industry. It's really cool to watch.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for talking today. I really appreciate the insight, and I definitely would love to come out to California and try the brand sometime. So if I can ever do that, I'll be looking you guys up. But I absolutely will be paying attention to see what you guys come up with next.
Awesome, Taylor. I appreciate your time today. Great combo.
Once again, that was Jigar Patel, the CEO of NorCal Cannabis. To find out more information about NorCal Cannabis, you can click the link attached in the article or visit their website at norcalcan.com. That's all for today's podcast. That's all for today's podcast. Podcast is now a certified word trademark on the blockchain through Cognate Incorporated CM certification. InvestorIdeas.com podcasts are also available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and TuneIn. If you'd like to be a guest or sponsor of this podcast, please contact InvestorIdeas.com. Investor Ideas reminds all listeners to read our disclaimers and disclosures on the InvestorIdeas.com website, and this podcast is not an endorsement to buy products or services or securities. Investors are reminded that all investments involve risk and possible loss of investment. Investor Ideas does not condone the use of cannabis except where permissible by law. Our site does not possess, distribute, or sell cannabis products.